Well, I'd like to thank you, Viv, because I wanted to show all the films because I think they're really powerful in a sequence, and especially the last one. And I'll say this, I'd love to see those live on a stage. I'd like to see that live. That would be very powerful for the audience to be actually in the room when those are performed, or and added to as well. And survivor voices, should be more and more out there. And I love what Claire Shaw said. We should be loud and proud, basically, and telling our story and not letting other people tell it for us. So thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. So
Thank
I didn't know
you.
this was kind of, this is an online film festival. I've never done an online film festival before. So to add all those films together and kind of create, the thing that comes across to me is, before we move into a panel discussion, is authenticity of the voice of survivors, actually speaking our truth to the world and using mediums that the world can't hide from. They can switch off and not look at it, but they can't hide from it because it's there. It's not kind of hidden in reports and things. So thank you very much. I forgot to say who I am. So I'm Rob Balfour, and I'm the founder and chief executive of Survivors West Yorkshire, and I've been around for so long now, I've forgotten how long I've been out here doing this stuff. Not quite as long as Raven. The Raven's been here since the 90s, but I've been here since the late 90s. And change is happening. And I'm really glad that creativity is becoming part of the mix, because historically I've tried to use some creativity in the way that we've done social campaigning, and our website shows something called A View from Inside the Box, which were a series of reports, but it used design. It used graphic design on the covers of things. And I was told at the time, and people might be shocked at this, not to do that because it would be seen as inappropriate, because you can't use design and imagery and color. It had to be blank and empty. You couldn't really speak to the audience in that way. You couldn't be creative because people would look down on the issue because of that. We've moved along a lot further now. Now everybody uses graphic design, don't they? But in those days when I first started, it wasn't. So I've always been a fan of creativity. I think it's really important. So thank you very much, guys, for agreeing to be on the panel. I forgot to tell something about Richard, though, which is really important, because Richard hasn't got a movie, but he's been running in the background for 20 years, not as just a strategic guy trying to change a system that is struggling on all sorts of levels. He's worked in mental health on the front line with people, mostly, I suspect, who had childhood sexual abuse histories in many cases, for 20 years in Leeds. An amazing project that I remember being founded, called Leeds Survivors Project. And it's quite amazing that, we are here having this conversation. And I'm going to give you a quote before I kind of ask you to kind of talk about things and ask you questions, really, which I think is a really powerful way to start this. And I found it on the internet just by searching. And it's about creativity and trauma. So more than anything in this world, trauma has been the source behind the greatest acts of transformation and creativity. And that's a quote by a guy called Brad Phillips, who I've never heard of, but I love that quote because I actually think it's true. I think if you look through history, if you look around, trauma creates creative processes where people, whether it's great writers, musicians, I've spoken to people who are, connected to some of the biggest bands in the world, and they'll tell you that a lot of people involved in that industry are survivors. They're creative and they do things. Film industry, theatre industry, write book, you name it, where it's creativity, survivors can be found in probably larger numbers than other parts of the population, because the trauma drives a need to be creative. So I'll start with a question, and you can choose to answer it, or I can ask you to answer it, whichever you want to do it, where you want to do it. Where have we been over the last 40 years? And Raven might have a really good perspective of the 90s and the pushback. So I'll start with Raven. Raven, where were we in the 1990s with creativity and activism?
Well, I mean, I would say in the very early 90s, there was a lot of breakthrough with survivor voices, and there was actually a lot of press coverage of survivor stories. I remember being shocked seeing it on covers of magazines and things like that. I'd never, child sexual abuse had never really been talked about publicly very much. Of course, it was talked about in the 1970s and 1980s with kind of feminist circles, but not really on the cover of like ladies magazines and things like that, or things that were, things like the New Yorker magazine and things like that. Like you wouldn't see that there. And just suddenly there was this amazing opening of survivors' voices, and some wonderful things happened in terms of like community, in terms of being able to find each other when I don't think that would have been possible before. But very soon after that, there was a backlash. And I think it started with a woman who was I think she was a university professor, but her parents were also professionals. Like they also, I think, I can't remember what they did, but she, in private, wanted to talk with them about the sexual violence that happened in their family. And because she was a very believable person, she wasn't like a public figure, but she was a university professor. So I think that they were afraid that she might go public with her story, and might give a lot of validation to survivors around the world. And so they started this backlash that they just made up out of the blue. This couple, they made up out of the blue this word that was the false memory syndrome, which may make people who are my age or older cringe. Anyway, it was just horrible, because then the press, instead of supporting survivors, which they had done for a short time, they made a complete U-turn, and they started attacking survivors. And there was just it was really awful to see, like, that change from being like open to being like, actually being attacked. Because I think these two people were quite wealthy, and they were, of course, able to link up with other people who, were maybe had profited from their children's abuse. And so they kind of formed like a political lobby, and they actually started lobbying. Anyway, horrible things. And that lasted for a while. It lasted for many years, like maybe about 7 years or something. And what happened to turn the tide, I believe, was research, because there was a lot of research into memory. And of course, what did they find? That, of course, their abuse is really, really prevalent, much more prevalent than people would like to think. And that the memories are in our bodies, that the memories are encoded in a different way than normal memories, like non-traumatic memories are. So there's all this research into traumatic memory. And I believe that's what started to turn the tide, where obviously it was disproven that this sort of made up syndrome thing was made up. It's not a real thing. So I think that kind of enabled the tide to turn a bit. And then there were amazing people like Judith Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery, I believe.
Trauma and Recovery.
And is that the name of the book? I'm just blanking on the name.
That's right. No.
And Bessel van der Kolk, who recently he's another trauma researcher. And basically we're getting like these kind of really amazing allies, which I believe helped to set the tide. And then there was the Me Too movement, which a lot of people spoke out about the things that had happened to them, different forms of sexual assault and sexual harassment. And I believe that the words, the vocabulary around trauma is starting to increase in the mainstream now. So it's people are beginning to be able to put words more, I believe, to their experiences, instead of just having absolutely no vocabulary, no language even for their experiences. But there's still a lot to do.
So we've moved along a long way since the 90s and the backlash, and the false memory people are still out there. So yet there's no evidence in psychology and brain research or anything to show false memory is real anyway, really. But they're still there and they still believe it's almost religious. And so backlash is normal and trauma is kind of in society, and women really describes it really well in her book about the pushback. And you can see those pushbacks over time. So we've been battling to change society, to my knowledge, for over 50 years. So, and the pushback, you can even, people are even arguing at the moment, there's pushback. So there's, it's there. So Patrick, coming to you, because you were in the theatre industry, and as a male survivor who hadn't connected to, what did you see or hear, in the days? Where were we for male survivors around the time you were, exploring in your head maybe and hearing narratives in the theatre and film and things in your community?
Well, maybe I was blind, but there was precious little going on. And I had to go to America. My first experience of a male survivors group was with Mike Lew in Kirkridge in Philadelphia. And suddenly I was in a room with 40 male survivors. I couldn't believe it. And half of them were gay and half of them were straight. And I'd never been in a mixed group like that. And I was absolutely terrified. And I remember saying how odd it was for me. I'd done a lot of gay men's work, but to be with straight men, and I think I was a bit naive. I may have said how grateful I was or something. And at the coffee break, this enormous American guy pulled me out into the car park and said, "Now you listen here. Don't give me any of that shite, that crap. It's the gay men in the room who are so emotionally open that they give the straight men permission to be emotionally open. So get back in there and talk your truth." And it was an amazing instruction to me. And that's when I realized that hearing all survivors, men, women, trans, non-binary, hearing survivors speak truth is what heals.
So Michael,
I've done 35, 40 years of one-on-one therapy, several different therapists, different modalities, all good. But the real shift has been A, in the group work, and B, in the body work.
So for people who don't know, Mike Lew is one of the very first authors of a book about male survivors called Victims No Longer. I think it was published in the late 80s, early 90s. Well worth reading.
Just come out, literally last week or 3 weeks ago, come out as an audio book.
Which is really good, so you can access it on, and it's a really powerful book for survivors and non-survivors. And it tells you what being a male survivor is. And it was one of the first books that I ever read. Personally, I know Mike. And he's been pivotal across the world in bringing group programs and has changed the lives of lots of male survivors. Thank you, Patrick. I'll go to Viv now. Viv, what, from your perspective, where were we when kind of 10, 20 years ago, when you were perhaps exploring your own artistic development, but also being a survivor? What did the landscape look like to you?
So if I think about the 90s, so I had dissociative amnesia, and I remembered being abused when I was 29 years old. So, and that was in the year 2000. So is that right? Yeah, that is right. My maths brain isn't working. So my experience of the 90s was that I was a raver. I was a new age traveler. I was a road protester. I was living outside. I'd found places to go that I felt safe, where there were other people who were marginalized and on the edge of society. So there was nowhere that I was doing a PhD, and I ran away from my PhD because I could not function in that environment to be a road protester. And I think it's really interesting because actually I was surrounded by survivors, but I didn't really know that. I didn't know I was a survivor, and I didn't really know they were a survivor. But I know now, I'm still in touch with loads of those people, and it's like that's what lots of us did, was found places that were safe to be like outside of the norms. And so at that time, what did happen for me is that I met survivors who were talking about their experiences for the first time. And that's literally like, I think it's 5 people. Before I remembered, I'd met 5 different people who had disclosed to me, and were on a journey with their own healing. And that's part of, like, hearing the words was part of what enabled me to then start to remember. um that I hadn't even heard the words child sexual abuse until I was 23 years old. So that's like the mid 80s or something. um there was no language. I think Raven referred to that, that we don't have the words to talk about it. And that's a lot of, like, the foundation of my work is like thinking about how do we create frameworks and language. There's a philosopher that I'm really interested in who was writing around that time in the late 80s. She was writing, Miranda Fricker, and she wrote about epistemic injustice, which is injustice around our ways of knowing things, and our credibility as knowers. And the thing, it's lots of long words that I can't explain because I'm not good at detail. What I've taken from it is the most common form of epistemic injustice that most of us understand is testimonial injustice, where somebody tells their story and then things to do with their character or behavior are used to undermine their testimony. So we're really used to hearing about that in rape trials, for example, where a woman's or a man's testimony is undermined by what they were wearing or whether they were drunk or all of those sorts of things. So that's testimonial injustice. Look, that's my hypervigilance. Someone's coming in and I needed to check. So all of that's still live for me. And then Miranda Fricker talks about hermeneutical injustice. And what that is where a community has had no access to mainstream discourse. So we haven't had access to mainstream media and mainstream academic discourse and things at the time that she was writing. And so therefore we lack frameworks or language by which to understand our own experiences. And so there is no way of us expressing what's happened to us or achieving justice or social justice, conventional justice or social justice, because we cannot talk about it. And so that thing, I think for me, that stuff, all of that philosophy, and then my very, very deep embodied experience of community that I had at that time and of direct action, those are the things that have led me to do the work that I do now. But it certainly wasn't in a conscious way. It was in a trying to find my way, it was me surviving by taking a lot of drugs and being very unconventional and living right on the edge of society in quite like, oh, I can't find the word, in not very safe ways a lot of the time. But all of those things have brought me here. So I'm grateful for them.
I think that sums up a lot of very kind of complex issues that have driven victim blaming, might be the word that we might use as a general term for it, and how it undermines the fight against child sexual violence, how it creates the pathways for the abusers. Thank you very much, Viv. I'm going to ask Neve. Neve wasn't born in the 1990s. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying that. So for you and your contemporaries who thought about, the street situations, the clubs you go to where spiking is almost, one of your friends told me, and it shocked me, and I'm glad I'm still shockable, is I said, how many of your friends, how many people do you think that you know have been spiked in clubs? And she said, every single one of them. And which is terrifying. It's kind of, she didn't know anybody who hadn't been spiked. And I find that awful. So where do you think we were, and what do you think has changed or is changing from your perspective, Neve?
Big question. I think, coming to university for me was really kind of eye-opening. I think it's kind of that experience for most people, especially me. I came from a very small town, very kind of like sheltered, didn't really know much about anything. And then I came to uni and it was like, oh God. I think the pandemic kind of also not helped with that, but there was so much online that everything became so accessible instantly. So you kind of got all this information about all these awful things happening in amongst a pandemic. But I don't know. I think that more people know about these things through social media and kind of the work that everyone here is doing. And yeah, I think that's positive. But yeah.
That's really good. Thank you. So I put you on the spot there a little bit because asking you for the past is a bit difficult, isn't it? Kind of look back. But I know you're all of your friends are really kind of informed and grounded. Richard, you're in a kind of strange position because you're kind of looking at the past and looking at, seeing where it's all gone wrong in many ways, because you hear those stories from a lot of the people that you're talking about. So what's your take on what went wrong in the past with the systems? Where have the mistakes been, and can you give a kind of overview of that?
Well, I think it comes back to where the power lies, really, and the power is just not being with survivors and activists. If it did, we wouldn't need to be activists. And I think the biomedical model has just contributed anyway to leaving child sexual abuse and the voice. And I just want to reflect on. I didn't bring a film. I'm not a filmmaker, but the amount of truth and wisdom writ large in those films was just remarkable. It is a powerful experience watching them. And you think, well, where was that? Why weren't people allowed to have that voice and to speak that truth? And because speaking that truth is the thing that will change. That kicks the doors in. I can be roundabout talking about trauma-informed approaches and the need for systemic change, and have to speak that language of commissioners and mental health professionals. And sure, I'm optimistic change is happening. But where is that real truth and wisdom and power that will just kick the doors in rather than just let chipping away at it? And why hasn't that been around there? Because of how power's functioned in society, and I think that's partly because there's been plenty of high-profile people that have benefited from that and have, been agents of sexual violence and abuse themselves, but also just because there's very little money in it. There's very little money in it. The, industrialized capitalist patriarchal system just doesn't really want to know. It can't turn a profit from it. So power has just been in the hands of people that haven't wanted to do anything about it. I mean, I remember Leeds Survivor-Led Crisis Service being set up. That was in the late 90s. I came in about 2000, 2001. And that just seemed extraordinary, that there were people, I'm not sure if there were survivors of abuse or not, but they expressed themselves as being survivors of the psychiatric system as well as mental health crisis. And the power had, that they'd been subjected to and had sort of re-traumatized them. A lot of that language around trauma-informed thinking wasn't really there, but even just, the massive chain of circumstances and kind of good fortune and allies that had to come together to give those people a platform, and allow them to speak their truth was huge. And Leeds has been quite progressive for those sort of things for a lot of time, but the amount of kind of strength and guts they had to get to that point, and the amount of support they needed from the system to make some space for them so they could take that space was just huge. And that was just a tiny pocket, and there were about 5 or 6 similar-ish projects set up at the same time, which I gather, apart from one, all folded within a few years just because, lack of funding and people lose interest, and it's like we're moving on to the next thing. It was just a small pot of money that's set up. Power's just not had any interest in giving people that voice, really. It's just kept them shushed. That's where it's gone wrong. And the biomedical approach has not wanted to listen to people's stories, because then it would be empowering. And I think it's better, it's more profitable if people are disempowered.
So, I mean, just to add something to you may not know, you may know about, I've spoken to you about, Wakefield and Bradford and Leeds were pioneering sexual violence services within the NHS 20 years ago. And it was driven by people who were, psychologists and psychiatrists who saw trauma as really the real issue they were dealing with. So they had the kind of personal leverage to do that. So as they retired or left, then those projects died and disappeared because there was nobody to drive them and to lobby for them in the, as you say, the around the tables with power and commissioning, which is a shame because they were leading the way 20 years ago. Quite amazing. I don't hear of many others, and there may be lots of us around the country, but just to reinforce that. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm conscious of time, so we can't run over it. So I'm going to kind of skip to the future to give you all an opportunity to kind of talk about what you hope for out of all the creativity that's generating, and you're all doing things in your own ways that are really driving change on the ground, with survivors directly, with policymakers, with commissioners. What is your hope and vision for the future? And I'm going to come straight back to Raven and say, of all the history we talked about, Raven, what is your hope for the future when you look out now with all the issues that we're facing in all sorts of areas for sexual violence survivors and the system changing, for society changing, and not rebooting back to where you described eloquently in the 1990s?
Well, I would love to see the we've talked a little bit about how there's this perception that there's survivors have to be strong and forgive people and be better than their abusers, whatever. Somehow it's always like put on us. But I would really love to see the shift be like, what makes an abuser an abuser? I would love to instead of victims being like pathologized, I would love to see the abusers pathologized. And I don't think that is actually happening, even though, it's like, oh, well, there's lots of, films, there's lots of very popular media about psychopaths, for instance, but it's all glorifying the violence. It's all glorifying cruelty instead of penalizing cruelty. And I would love to see things shift. So there's a lot more research about like, why do psychopaths, why do sociopaths do this? Why are they committing these crimes, and how do we stop them? And then also translating that into the whole culture of leadership, where we see leaders who are clearly psychopaths, and why are we allowing these people to destroy our world, our planet, to steal, basically steal our any kind of community wealth, or like the steal our labor, steal our health. Why are we allowing this to happen? Because I think that I feel like the dynamic that's in the family, where there's like someone who's abusive and everybody else has to shut up and cooperate, that I believe that same dynamic is in operation in our whole society, and that we need to look at how we are acting out as a whole species. How are we acting out, reenacting this childhood thing that happened? Why are we allowing that? Anyway, I could go on and on, so I'll stop.
I think you really kind of described a big question about society. Remember, former Prime Minister, we've had quite a few, haven't we? And it was, I've forgotten which one it was, but she said that society needs to look in the mirror. And that was Mrs. May. So Mrs. May said society, the biggest challenge for society, be looking in the mirror and seeing why all of this has happened. And I think that was one of the most truthful things that Mrs. May ever said, because I think that's reality. So thank you very much for reinforcing that in many ways. Patrick, I'll turn to you. And I know that you're all over the world in some ways. You're definitely over Europe, because I know you're involved with the Brave movement, and the Brave movement is global. What's your vision for the future for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, sexual violence?
Do you know you're muted, Patrick?
Sorry, I'm in a rather noisy place, which is why. I'll speak very quickly. First of all, I want to say I really have enjoyed watching the films today. Really, really stimulating, all of them. I'd so like to talk about the animation more because I find that so fascinating. And I mean, Viv, your work is just so provocative. It makes me shake. It really does. Because you're talking, and I think it's about talking. We are in a culture of silencing. I have a particular beef with insurance companies. A lot of the public discourse and a lot of the culture of the way survivors are treated is directed 100% by insurance companies. Local authorities, education authorities, health trusts are so frightened of being sued. They are so frightened of the American model coming over that they just want to silence people. And one of the things we are doing by making art is we are talking. But I don't want the people listening to think that you have to make a film in order to talk. You don't. All survivors have a right over their information. All survivors have a right to talk about their experience when they want to, if they want to, or to remain silent. We're just crazy people who like to make art, you know, and thank God we're here, but my God, it hasn't made me rich, and I'm sure it hasn't made any of you rich. I'd rather have been a dentist. But when the time is ripe to speak, we have to speak. I had only been in the Brave movement 4 months, and I was suddenly outside the G7 summit asking questions of the world press on a microphone. And, you know, if I can do it, anyone can do it. And we are so stigmatized. We have to ride through the stigma and realize that we have a right to speak. Because when enough of us realize that, then they will have to listen. And I totally agree with Raven that there needs to be much more visible research. Again, we have to look in America. You know, Elizabeth Letourneau is working with teenagers who come forward and admit that their sexual preferences for children. I think he's called Michael Cito, a Canadian, is doing research into what it is that actually causes paedophile tendencies to be acted on. And until we stop just thinking the paedophile is the bogeyman who should just be put in prison, that's too simplistic. I'm not excusing paedophilia. Fuck no, you know, my life was very severely damaged by a paedophile. But we have to look very carefully at the subject and in detail, but with energy. I'm going to the Vatican. The Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors has existed for 9 years, and it's only now really beginning to get its act together. And there are local authorities. My local authority in Kent. I have to be careful what I say, but you know, I told them I was coming to the Vatican. They've ignored it completely. There's no dialogue because there's fear. We just have this, the taboo has to go. It's a horrible thing and it has to stop. And that's one of the reasons I support the Brave movement at the moment. I'm a passionate supporter of the Brave movement because it is survivor-led. There's nobody telling us what we should do. We are saying what we want to say. I think that's enough.
I think I've said something very eloquently, put a lot of very powerful messages. And I think, you know, all of us, everyone involved in the change that is coming, I don't think it can be stopped. I think it is a shift. I think it can be resisted, but you can't stop it now. Is we're going to have to deal with you know, survivors are an elephant in the room in the system, and that elephant is stamping his feet increasingly. But we're going to have to deal with the perpetrators. We're going to have to work out. I mean, there are some I've spoken to people who worked in America many years ago with them in prison. They said, well, what do you think creates them? And his response was, they like doing what they do. If that is the case, if it is pure choice, then we've got a big problem with how to manage them, really, because they choose to do it. So we're going to have to think very creatively to kind of end that perpetration and change silence is shattering of that, I think, is one way to kind of make that landscape they hunt in more difficult. So I'll go off and I'll do my kind of thing. And I'm the chair, not the panel, so I'm going to ask you. So I'm going to go to Viv. What is your vision for the future for survivors?
I have a clear and juicy vision for survivors, and but before I go into that, I just want to say that and this isn't to sort of disagree with anything that's been said, but I have personal strong feelings for myself that I don't want to. I'm happy to do it here, but I don't want to talk about perpetrators. I don't want to think about how we stop people perpetrating in my own work. I find it really, really difficult. It taps into that place for me where it's survivors taking responsibility for other people's bad behavior and trying to figure out what needs to happen for those people to change. So I'm just voicing that because in case anyone else in the room is feeling that as well, that and I'm really, really happy people who feel that they can do that work and can do that with it safely and with their own integrity and well-being intact. That's really great. And I'm just saying that I can't, and that I've had to make a really clear decision to not go there. Obviously, I want abuse to stop. And the way that I see that happening, and this is my clear and juicy vision, which may be horribly misguided, but this is what I believe in, and this is the hill that I will die on. So is around community, building community and critical mass. I think if we look throughout history at all marginalized communities, and how they have made change at all civil rights movement, it's been marginalized communities coming together, representing their own interests, that has driven change. So the things that are barriers to that for us is that we don't really fully understand ourselves as a community, and we don't really fully understand ourselves as a marginalized community, but we share so many common experiences of marginalization, cultural oppression, and discrimination. And so a lot of what I would like to see happen is for us to be able to articulate that better, of what those common experiences are. I mean, we are literally we're overrepresented in every marginalized community, on mental health wards, in suicide statistics, in addiction statistics, in prison populations, in pupil referral units. We are in all of the most marginalized places in society is full of survivors. In homelessness, it's where we're in those places. And so we need to understand what it is, rather than dealing with those single issues, deal with the underlying issue of child sexual abuse that is happening on such a huge scale, and that is failing to be dealt with by the systems. The justice system is a catastrophic shit show. None of us get justice. Very few of us get justice. And what does justice look like in this context? Actually, the mental health system is a catastrophic shit show. Neither of these things serve us at all, and they've got no interest in changing. The only way they're going to change is if enough of us can come together and have spaces to gather and have the conversations that we've never been able to have. I can't say what survivors need, because I haven't had enough time with other survivors to have those conversations. It'd be arrogant of me to say this is what is needed. But what I know is that if we can build those spaces for people to come together, then collectively we can represent our own interests. And if enough of us come together and we reach critical mass, then we are unignorable, and then everything has to change. And I truly believe that will happen. And I think it's going to happen really, really fast. And I'm hoping that the systems that have thrived from ignoring us are ready for that, because they're going to have to make some really speedy changes. And that's really excites me. It really excites me. Someone asked me at a conference recently, like, what would you do if you had a magic wand? And I was like, I don't want a magic wand. I want to watch the exquisite unfolding of justice. And I'm so excited to be alive in this moment where this is happening. and I want to watch it, and I want to savor every minute of it. So that's where I'm at. I want that. The other thing I want to say is that I really want to see CSA survivor experiences as a protected characteristic. We can't have that until we can understand the ways in which our common marginalizations, oppressions, and discrimination, experiences of discrimination. And, you know, I want statutory access. I don't want trauma informed. I don't want things to be trauma informed. I want statutory access like every other marginalized community, which is imperfect. I know all the communities that have statutory access, it's not perfect, but it is backed up by law, and that's what I want. There you go. I'll get off my soapbox now, but that's where I'm at.
I can see the audience clapping. I think that, you know, your final point about statutory obligation is well made. All of those points are well made. But until the system cannot look the other way and cannot bury the issue because it's faced with a legal obligation and there's a protected characteristic, then you can keep pushing at it and it will change, but it'll be slowly. But the change is to the benefit of the system. You just described the issues, looking the other way and burying your head in the sand and saying it's too complex to deal with. It's just a load of rubbish. The reality is it is dealable with, but you have to change the way you deal with it. It's the old cliche about it's not hard to reach, it's because you're not reaching the right way. And I think that is an important point to make. So before I get on my soapbox, because I kind of have that soapbox gene thing, let me go to Richard and ask Richard, who's someone who's actually sitting on the front line. And I'll start by saying, I don't see the people in the system, and I've been 25 years kind of talking to them, as the bad people. I just think that the people are kind of scared to make the change. What is your perspective of kind of meeting them and trying to get change in a city that's open to it in many ways, like Leeds?
Well, in terms of what it looked like, as you know, your initial question of what was the vision is what I would like to see. And just to give an example, so this morning I've been doing all through the year an hour and a half session, sort of an introduction to trauma-informed approaches for new people who are coming into the community mental health system, whether they're CPNs or pharmacists or whatever. And that's kind of progress after 20 years of being at loggerheads with the system. The fact that they're asking me to pitch up and do that is progress. But what would be significant progress if staff were routinely released for a couple of hours to watch those films, you know, about something like that. And it's like, actually, that's valuing the survivor voice and actually teaching people something in a much more powerful way than me being in a room with a PowerPoint, you know. So I would like to see that. And I think, you know, speaking the language of commissioners, you know, we've been having these kind of conversations, Rob, about creative paths to healing, you know, things that are films, creative writing, photography, music, all these things that can lead to, and, you know, putting it in commissioner language, we've settled on broadening the range of interventions, which makes it sound so boring, but it's like, let's just not, you know, it's okay, sort out physical healthcare, sort out mental health care, make sure that accessibility is there, statutory access is just kind of fully boxed off. That's a big job. But also just routinely allowing people to, empowering people to seek out those different ways, because, you know, psychology and counselling isn't for everybody, you know. Mental health support, medication isn't for everybody. What about creative writing or the opportunity to make a film? Whatever it takes to allow that person to speak their truth, you know, or just a safe space for that person. Like Patrick says, it's not necessarily about doing some big creative project, but just creating a safe space for somebody to speak their truth. That's getting the basics right, you know. And now we're having to frame it in like, well, we need to upskill the workforce so that they're confident working with disclosure. I mean, what could be more basic than just creating a safe space for somebody to say this happened, and for somebody to say, I'm so sorry it happened to you. You know, something I talk about a lot in training and so on. A survivor of really sort of serious organised abuse over many years, and they said the most significant thing anybody ever said to me, it was a GP actually, who said, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Because the power of that belief and just being alongside in that moment, said I felt so validated and seen. And it was just so valuable. And just creating a system where that is the norm, which just seems extraordinary, you know, that we're still so far away from that. But I'm seeing progress. And it's just getting the change makers to kind of listen and just making that space. I mean, you know, I'd like to just kick the doors in and just like get everybody rushing and say, you take the space, you know, like let's seize this power. But it's so heavily gate kept. it's difficult. You've got to like be diplomatic, you know, and you've got to speak the right kind of language and find the right kind of words, and that is kind of frustrating. But bit by bit, as much as I like, you know, I do want radical change to come, and I think it's possible. But we've just got to keep having the conversations and keep pushing it, because in some regards, it is a bit of an opening door. There's enough people listening, so we know, you know, people say the community mental health system's just broken. You know, it's not working for staff, let alone the people that are using services, you know. So I think it starts with that acknowledgement that we're getting this all wrong, you know, and I think the vision is one where people say, we've got a lot to figure out. That's okay. We've got to figure this shit out, you know, we've got to go places, but the lived experience, the survivor voice has got to be right at the heart of that, or otherwise it just will not be authentic.
I mean, I agree with all of that, Richard. I think it's kind of a message I give, and it's kind of uncomfortable, is, you know, we can't, you know, you can't hang around because you're losing people all the time. So the time is here for change, because all the knowledge and the information is there to do it. It's the will. It's like politicians, professionals. You need the professional will, the political will to just do it, because we're losing people. Those people don't deserve to be lost, whether they're psychologically lost or they're lost. You know, so change will end lots of that. I'm absolutely convinced, but we need to act. I'm going to come to.
Could I just jump in with one thing, just to
Okay.
say, like there's systems change, isn't there, and then there's culture change, and they're both important. And I think, like, sometimes we think that that systems change comes first and then culture change follows, but actually it can be the other way around. And I think that's a really, because systems are they're like, you know, turning around big tankers, aren't they? They're so hard to shift. But we've seen with things like Black Lives Matter, if there's enough noise about something, then every system has to change. And again, it's imperfect. I'm not saying, you know, that it's perfect, but find me an organization that doesn't have an anti-racist policy. You know, it's like, that's something that came from culture and not from working incrementally with systems. And I have so much respect for anyone who, I find it deeply frustrating, so I have so much respect for anyone who is doing that work, and it's so important, and it's not either or anything's better than anything else, but it is like that play, like that's a lot of what I believe in, is holding hope around the culture change and what that can do if we can do that, because I feel like that's easier.
Yeah, and I think the change will come from the community, not from systems, because I think the communities will demand the change, because trauma-informed is becoming a narrative in society, and they're going and saying, I don't want tablets, I want trauma-informed responses. They're starting to say that. I'm hearing it from the people who come to our service. There is a shift. More young males are coming to counselling services than I've ever seen, and being reported in lots of services, and they're coming in their early 20s. That was never the case 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you'd be in your 50s or 60s when you were talking to somebody. That's what the age was. Now they're in their early 20s. There's a shift happening outside of systems, and I don't think they really realise that it's coming, and it's coming from their customers, from people who use their services. They're asking for different things. But I could go on about that forever, and we could maybe have another podcast and talk about that. Neve, I'm going to come to you because you are the youngest person in the room, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. So what do you want for the future for victims of all these interpersonal crimes? What's your vision?
I think everything that everyone said. I always imagine it as kind of a ball, and everyone's chipping away from different angles, all just trying to work their way to the center, and you just want to get a sledgehammer and just smash the ball up and just let it all out. And like, it would be amazing to be at that point where it just breaks and everything kind of comes out and the change just starts. But the change is happening. Everything you chip at is making that change. And I think it's really, like, I've only been doing this for 3-4 years probably. I've been actively taking action, and it feels constantly like you could be doing more and you're not doing enough and you're not getting anywhere. But like, every time you do something, every time you show up, every time you make something, you're chipping away and the issue is getting smaller. And I think that's the only way to move forward, is just chipping away. And hopefully we get to a point where there's not much more chipping to do and we can start growing.
Thank you very much, Neve. Someone's left a message on the chat directly to me, and I think it's kind of reinforces lots of the conversation we have. What this is all about, really, and it's about human beings. And what they, you know, it kind of sounds cliche kind of thing to say, but kind of just repeat what they've said. I lost my sister to suicide in 2009. She was failed so badly by the system. We both went through CSA trafficking, and I don't feel there has been much change in the system at all since then. For survivors, I think the system needs to hear those messages. Survivors you're losing people because we're not shifting fast enough. And I know it's difficult, and all the resistance and all the risk aversion and all the rest of it, but you know, that's one person who maybe wouldn't have been lost if the system had been shifted. I think that's what it's about. I think, you know, we can have all the discussions, go around the table. The National Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, you know, produces £180 million worth of lawyer investigation, and what it produces is a report that sits on the shelf, as far as anyone can see at the moment. Hopefully that changes soon, you know, and it's about that person and their life. So that's what I do this for, continue to do this after 25 years, is, you know, we don't need to lose anybody else. We need to make sure we as Desmond Tutu said, we need to stop pulling, we need to pull people out downstream, but we also need to stop them coming into that river by changing society and dealing with them better. And systems can do that. I don't think it's a scary thing to work trauma-informed responsive, but I think it's easy, frankly. But you know, people seem so resistant to it. I don't think we're running to the end. We have a couple of minutes, so I don't want to hog it. So I want to thank you all for doing this, because I've never done this before, and when I look back at the recording, I'll never do it again. But I wanted you to, I think you've been amazing. The expectations for this are we're not anywhere as high as what you have actually produced. I think that we should be more of these conversations. I think that we should be more diverse voices talking, creativity, and I know Viv is doing that in Upfront Survivors and bringing people in. All of this, Richard is doing it, Neve is doing it in the university, Patrick is doing it with the Brave Movement, Raven does it in her way, I do it in my way. We need more of these conversations. And hopefully more of the systems people will start watching these videos and attending them and listening to them. Because I've not heard anything, but I know we have a Minister for Common Sense now in the new cabinet. And, you know, but I've not heard anything except common sense here this evening. So thank you. I don't know if people want to kind of wave and say whatever, but I think we're at the end. And we'll say goodbye and thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.